It is the 19th of December 1944, and the coldest winter in a generation has clamped down over the Ardennes. Out in the freezing dark, the German army is tearing the American front to pieces. 3 days ago, 200,000 German troops came smashing out of the snow, and now the line is buckling. Units are surrounded. Roads are choked with men falling back through the cold. Inside a damp squad room at Verdun, the most senior officers in the American army stand around a map. A single stove loses its fight against the chill. The mood is close to despair. Then, Dwight Eisenhower turns to the one man already leaning forward, already grinning, and asks how fast he can turn his entire army 90 degrees to the north and counterattack straight into the side of the German advance. And George Patton gives an answer so audacious that the generals in the room think, for a moment, that he must be joking. This is the story of that promise, of an army turned sideways in the snow, a prayer written for the weather, and a single tank that broke through to a town that would not surrender. Welcome back to America's War Archives. If you're new here, stick around. This is exactly the kind of story we live for. The storm in the Ardennes. Just days earlier, the Allies had been quietly confident the war might be over by spring. The Germans were beaten. The Ardennes was a quiet sector, held thin on purpose, defended by tired veterans and green troops learning the ropes. That was exactly what Hitler was counting on. In total secrecy, under radio silence and foul weather, the Germans massed a huge striking force in the forest opposite that thin line, and on the 16th of December, they unleashed it. A massive bombardment tore through the pre-dawn dark, and the German armor rolled forward out of the fog. The attack was a total surprise. American units were overwhelmed, surrounded, or shattered. Communications collapsed. A great bulge was punched westward into the line, the feature that gave the battle its name. For a few desperate days, it looked like the German plan might actually work. And one small Belgian town suddenly became the most important ground in the entire war. Bastogne was nothing to look at, a quiet market town in the snow, but 7 major roads met there, radiating out in every direction. In the frozen, broken country of the Ardennes, where tanks and trucks could not cross the fields, those roads were everything. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the movement of armies through the whole region. The Americans rushed in the 101st Airborne, the paratroopers known as the Screaming Eagles, thrown into the line short of ammunition, short of winter clothing, short of almost everything. They dug into the frozen earth around the town. By the 21st of December, the Germans had flowed around Bastogne on both sides and linked up behind it. The town was completely surrounded, cut off, freezing, outnumbered, and a thick fog overhead grounded the Allied Air Force, choking off any hope of supply or air support. Something had to be done, and it had to be done fast, which brings us back to that cold room at Verdun. The promise that stunned the room. Eisenhower wanted to strike the long exposed southern flank of the bulge. The army best positioned to do it belonged to Patton, but there was a catch, an enormous one. Patton's Third Army was not facing north. It was facing east, locked in its own major offensive, fully committed, supply lines running the wrong way entirely. To do what Eisenhower wanted, Patton would have to break off that attack, disengage divisions that were actively fighting, wheel them 90 degrees, move them 100 miles over icy roads, and throw them into a fresh battle against a victorious enemy. In December, in the snow, by every rule of war, that was the work of weeks, not days. So when Eisenhower asked how soon he could attack, every officer in the room expected the honest answer to be a week or more. Patton did not say a week. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. Some thought he was being theatrical or bravado, promising the impossible for effect. Turning a whole army through a right angle and attacking within 2 days simply was not credible. But here is the detail that turns bravado into genius. Patton was not guessing. In the days before the conference, as the German offensive unfolded, He had quietly ordered his staff to draw up 3 separate contingency plans, each for a different way the Third Army might be ordered to respond. The routes, the timing, the movement orders already written. So when Patton made his impossible promise, he simply asked for a telephone, called his headquarters, and spoke a pre-arranged code phrase. That single phrase set one of the 3 plans into motion. Across the Third Army, orders that had already been written began going out. The wheels were turning before the conference even ended. What looked like a reckless boast was foresight, preparation, and a staff that had readied itself for the worst while everyone else was still reacting. The man himself, Patton, was 60 years old, silver-haired, with a high, reedy voice that startled everyone because it did not match the legend. Ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, a helmet polished like a parade. He prayed every morning and swore magnificently every afternoon. He believed, without irony, that he had lived past lives as a Roman legionary and a soldier under Napoleon. He had been wounded in the First World War and come back. He had nearly destroyed his career by slapping a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily and fought his way back from that too. In the summer of 1944, he had led the breakout from Normandy, racing across France at a speed that stunned the Germans. He drove his men relentlessly, certain that speed and aggression saved more lives than caution ever did. The relief of Bastogne would become his masterpiece, turning an army. What the Third Army did next is still studied as one of the great feats of the war. It meant pulling divisions out of an active battle without letting the enemy notice, untangling thousands of vehicles, rerouting fuel and ammunition in a whole new direction, traffic control on single-lane roads sheeted with ice, where one jackknifed truck could halt a column for miles, all of it in bitter cold. Against the clock, the Third Army did it. Columns of tanks and half-tracks ground north over frozen roads. Staff officers worked around the clock. Patton was everywhere, prowling the roads in his staff car, dragging his army north by sheer force of will. On the 22nd of December, almost exactly on the timeline he had promised, the attack went in. The drive north. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the drive, with the 26th and 80th Infantry behind. Punch a corridor through the Germans, reach the surrounded town, break the siege. What followed was some of the hardest fighting of the whole battle. Temperatures far below freezing, roads like sheets of ice, tanks sliding on frozen hills. The men pushed through knee-deep snow into determined German resistance because the Germans knew exactly what was coming and threw everything into stopping it. The advance was slower than Patton wanted. The Germans contested every village, every crossroads, every ridge. The relief force fought for every mile, taking casualties the whole way. And the fog was strangling everything, because as long as it hung overhead, the Air Force could not fly. The prayer for weather. For days the overcast had grounded every Allied plane. With clear skies, fighter bombers could hammer the German tanks, and transports could drop supplies to the surrounded defenders. The fog made all of it impossible. Patton, furious, reached for an unusual weapon. He ordered the Third Army chaplain to write a prayer for good weather. It was printed and handed out to tens of thousands of soldiers across the frozen front. Around the 23rd of December, the weather broke. The fog lifted. The skies cleared. Transport planes roared over Bastogne, dropping bundles of supplies by parachute. Fighter bombers swept low over the German positions. For the men below, it was almost miraculous. Patton, never one to miss a moment, reportedly credited the chaplain's prayer directly and saw to it he was decorated for it. With the Air Force back in the fight, the balance shifted. The relief column drove the last frozen miles toward the town. By the 26th of December, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored were close, fighting through the final German positions. At the very tip of the advance rolled a single Sherman tank, pushing cautiously through the snow toward the American perimeter. Late in the afternoon, it finally rumbled through the last stretch of contested ground and made contact with the engineers of the 101st Airborne, holding the southern edge. After days of ice, snow, and fire, the corridor was opened. The siege of Bastogne was broken. It was thin and fragile, and hard fighting would go on for weeks. But the breakthrough was real. Supplies flowed in, the wounded flowed out. Patton had done exactly what he promised in that cold room at Verdun, on very nearly the timeline he had named. What it meant, the relief of Bastogne, did not end the Battle of the Bulge, that fighting ground on into January, one of the bloodiest battles the American army ever fought, but it marked the moment the German gamble collapsed. The offensive had depended on speed, surprise, and taking road junctions like Bastogne. The town's refusal to fall threw off the German timetable at the worst possible moment. And Patton's lightning pivot turned a defensive crisis into a counterattack. Hitler had thrown his last reserves into the Ardennes, and they were being ground to pieces, with nothing left to replace them. From that point on in the West, there were no more grand German offensives. Only the slow collapse of a war Germany could no longer win. And at the heart of it stood one decision in a cold room at Verdun, when everyone expected the safe answer, and one man chose the bold one instead. That's going to do it for this one. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. It genuinely helps get these stories out to more people who love history. And if you're not already subscribed to America's War Archives, now is a great time to fix that. Leave a comment about which part surprised you most, and we'll see you in the next one.